In Ukraine, night does not hide men, it lists them. Thermal sights do not care about darkness, so a body becomes a glowing signal and a short pause becomes a mistake that can be punished in seconds. This story follows a night sniper on the Ukrainian side, moving deep into dangerous ground while Russian troops keep doing what soldiers have always done after sunset: walking, stopping, whispering, and trusting the black sky to cover them. Then the pattern breaks. The first impact is not just a hit, because it is a question spreading through the group. Where did it come from? Who is watching? And how long have we been tracked? In modern war, the real advantage is not seeing, it is seeing first. And once a thermal lens locks on, the night turns into a one-way window. What looks like a few silent shots can ripple outward, forcing units to slow, split, and hesitate. And that hesitation can decide what happens before any bigger fight even starts. Stay with Military Force, hit like, and subscribe for clear, grounded battlefield analysis you can trust. In these night encounters, Russian soldiers are not revealed by noise or bright light, but by heat and habit. Because movement and short pauses on open ground create clear signatures that a thermal scope can read. A small group crosses a bare stretch, and the lead man becomes the first clean shape, so one round ends him before the rest understand that contact has started. The shot does not announce itself in the usual way, because a suppressor cuts the sharp crack, and the sound that remains is hard to place in the dark. That gap in awareness matters, because the second man reacts late, scans the wrong direction, and wastes seconds trying to guess what cannot be guessed. When the battlefield feels silent but someone is already measuring, the mind starts to race ahead of the facts, and that is where panic begins to grow. Thermal optics change the logic of safe movement at night, because the shooter does not need a spotlight or a tracer to track a target that is still warm. A soldier who believes darkness is cover often moves in straight lines between darker patches, and that predictability becomes a guide rather than a shield. Even a careful pace can betray a position, since a body stands out against colder ground, and a short stop creates a fixed point that can be corrected for range. Once the first man drops, the rest do what humans do under surprise. They freeze, they crouch, they look for a flash, and they listen for a direction. But with a suppressor and distance, the scene offers almost no clear clue, and the uncertainty itself becomes a weapon that keeps squeezing. A second moment shows the same trap in a different form, because a larger element is found not while sprinting, but while resting. At least 4 soldiers are detected during a brief pause, and the key detail is not their number, but their posture, because a pause often means lowered focus. Some stand half upright, some turn their backs, and some groups close enough to share a cigarette, and that cluster makes the decision easy for the shooter. The first impacts land fast, and the group does not fight back in a normal way because nobody is sure where to aim. That is why the sequence feels like hunting, since the targets are reacting inside a fog of missing information, not trading fire in a clear duel. The repeated hits in a short window deepen that feeling, because each strike arrives before the group can reset, and that timing breaks confidence faster than raw casualties. Night sniping wins a psychological advantage when it steals orientation, because sound, flash, and direction are the 3 cues that usually help a unit recover. When 2 of those cues are reduced and the third is absent, the mind fills the gap with fear, and fear pushes bad choices. Some soldiers run into more exposed ground, others dive into shallow cover that does not conceal heat, and others stay still, hoping the shooter has moved on. All 3 reactions can be punished, because thermal vision rewards the shooter with steady tracking and punishes the target for any clear outline. A unit that feels watched also begins to doubt its own routine, so leaders hesitate to move teams at night, and that hesitation spreads backward along the route. It becomes hard to know whether the front element was seen 5 seconds ago or 20 minutes ago, and that question alone can slow an entire plan. But the night battlefield is not an action movie, because one small error can flip the roles and the hunter can become the hunted. In night fighting, the most dangerous moment is not the perfect shot. It is the imperfect one, because a single miss can turn a clean ambush into a fast chase where seconds decide who stays alive. The first problem starts small, because the target does not even understand danger is nearby. A suppressor dulls the sound, so there is no clear crack, no bright flash, and no obvious direction to point at. That is why the first miss matters, because the target keeps moving for a heartbeat longer than he should, and that extra distance changes angles, range, and cover. Then the target hears something strange, not a normal rifle report, but a muted snap that feels far and everywhere, and that confusion triggers the sprint. When a man runs in the dark, he does not run tactically, he runs emotionally, and the night turns his fear into speed. That sudden speed forces the shooter to shift from selection to correction, and the scene tightens into a race that cannot be paused. And once that race begins, calm is no longer guaranteed. The second shot can miss for reasons that look simple on paper, but are brutal in real time. A moving target is a moving puzzle, because the body is now leaning forward, arms are pumping, and the stride keeps changing as feet hit uneven ground. Thermal optics help, but they do not freeze reality, and a running man can briefly blend with background clutter like warm wreckage, fresh exhaust, or a heated patch of soil. That means the crosshair is not chasing a clean shape, it is chasing a pattern that keeps breaking apart. So the second miss is not a failure of equipment. It is a reminder that war punishes tiny timing errors. And with each miss, the margin for a quiet exit shrinks. The third shot ends the chase, but it does not erase the risk that the chase created. By the time the target collapses, the sound of movement, the scrape of boots, and the direction of the run can pull attention from nearby troops. Even if the enemy did not locate the shooter, they now know one thing for sure. Someone is operating in their space, and someone is close enough to reach them in the dark. That awareness can trigger a harsh response, because units under stress often reach for area fire when they cannot find a precise source. A few blind bursts, a flare, a mortar round, or a quick drone check can arrive not because the enemy is confident, but because fear demands action. This is the hidden price of a missed shot, because it can light up the grid around the shooter even when the shooter stays unseen. So the win still has a shadow, and the shadow is escalation. Close-range night combat also flips the meaning of distance, because being closer does not always mean being safer. A short gap can help the shooter see detail, but it also means the shooter is inside the enemy's reaction circle if the target survives long enough to shout or fire back. It only takes one lucky tracer, one guess direction, or one team pushing toward the noise to force a rapid withdrawal. Thermal vision can guide a shot, yet it cannot guarantee silence after contact, especially when the enemy has drones that can scan routes, mark heat, or direct indirect fire. That is why the rhythm changes from patient hunting to urgent decision-making, where the shooter must choose between pressing for a finish or breaking off before the sky starts watching too. The night offers advantage, but it also demands discipline, because the smallest slip can invite a much larger problem. And that reality sets up the bigger reveal, because the shooter's identity carries consequences far beyond one dark field. When the story finally lifts the veil on who is behind the scope, it stops being only a battlefield episode and becomes a window into an international war. The reveal matters, because the shooter is not presented as a local symbol, but as a foreign volunteer fighting under Ukraine's flag. And that changes how this battlefield story is read. In this case, the name Otto is described as a security name, not an identity, because real names can become coordinates in a war that never sleeps. Behind that call sign sits a German from Bavaria, about 49 years old, a demolition contractor by trade, and a man with sniper training from the Bundeswehr. So the night shots are not only about one unit's tactics, they also point to a wider pipeline of people crossing borders to join a front line. And that pipeline is where this story starts to widen. That pipeline runs through the International Legion of Ukraine, which expanded fast after the 2022 invasion and then had to harden under real combat pressure. The reporting places Otto in areas around Kyiv during heavy fighting, where Russian forces were trying to push and where Ukrainian units needed eyes and precise fire. This detail matters because it shows the Legion is not only a rear area label, since many volunteers end up attached to Ukrainian formations and to Ukrainian command needs. And once that happens, a volunteer's skill set becomes part of Ukraine's daily combat rhythm. That daily rhythm is where the numbers become political. Numbers around the Legion are hard to verify, and that uncertainty is part of the picture. Early claims suggested more than 20,000 people signed up within roughly a month, yet later estimates often shrink to only a few thousand who stayed for direct combat roles. Sources also describe volunteers coming from more than 55 countries, which sounds simple until the question becomes who is trained, who is stable, and who will stay after the first artillery shock. Veterans have said the early problem was not a lack of tough people, but the dropout rate, because many left after their first experience with Russian shelling. So the Legion's headline size and its effective size can be two different things, and that gap shapes public expectations. And those expectations do not stay inside Ukraine. This international layer also changes the information war, because volunteers from countries with big media reach can share trench-level accounts that travel very fast. That visibility can pull attention back to a conflict that many audiences stop following day by day right now. But the same exposure carries risk, because every captured volunteer and every casualty can spark debate at home. So one fighter can shift headlines abroad. And once headlines move, governments have to react. The legal and political side follows close behind, even when it stays off camera. Some states restrict enlistment abroad on paper, others tolerate it quietly, and a few threaten penalties that can reach citizenship status. Even when prosecutions are unlikely, the gray zone still matters, because it forces volunteers to think about consequences after the war, not only survival during it. And that means a private decision to fight can echo into foreign policy arguments far from the trenches. And those arguments end up shaping what support looks like. On the ground, the key point is that a sniper like Otto is not just a shooter, but a lever that can change how whole groups behave after dark. Once soldiers believe an unseen foreign-trained marksman is working nearby, they do not only fear the bullet, they fear the uncertainty. That uncertainty slows movement, breaks formation habits, and makes the night feel watched. And that is the bridge ahead, because the real effect of a sniper is measured in how an entire unit dares, or refuses, to move in the dark. A sniper's mission is not only to take a life, because the larger outcome is what happens to the living after the first body drops and the night stops feeling neutral. When one man falls without a clear muzzle flash or a loud report, the group loses its strongest anchor, which is direction. And that missing direction turns into delay, hesitation, and wrong movement. Some soldiers freeze because they cannot place the threat, while others scatter too early and create gaps that break mutual support. And both reactions come from the same problem. The mind is forced to guess with almost no clean signals. In that moment, the sniper is not just shooting, the sniper is shaping behavior, since the fear of an unseen watcher can be stronger than the fear of a known rifle line. That fear is what starts rewriting the unit's rhythm, and the rest of the night begins to bend around it. The most vulnerable window is often the pause, because a pause is when posture changes, weapons dip, heads turn away, and attention briefly shifts from threat to task. A team stops to catch breath, check a phone, wait for a cue, or simply reset spacing, and that short break creates a fixed picture that a skilled shooter can read fast. In open ground, the pause becomes even louder in visual terms, because bodies hold still long enough to confirm range and priority. And the cluster effect makes it worse when several men stand close enough to share the same confusion. One quiet hit can send the entire group into a scramble, not because they lack courage, but because they lack a reliable point to aim at. and that uncertainty makes every choice feel like a trap. So the pause, which is supposed to reduce risk, becomes the very moment that amplifies it, and that reversal is what gives night sniping its leverage. Over time, that leverage shows up as self-limitation, because troops begin to treat darkness as a threat multiplier instead of a shield. Routes that used to be normal get avoided, shortcuts through open patches are dropped, and leaders start adding extra checks that slow movement even when no shots are fired. This change is quiet but decisive, since a unit that moves later moves slower, and a unit that moves slower becomes easier to observe, and that loop can shrink options on its own. The sniper does not need to win every exchange to have impact, because the real win is forcing the enemy to spend time, energy, and attention on not dying, rather than on pushing forward. Once the night becomes a place where every step feels watched, the battlefield starts to expand inside people's heads, and that is where tempo begins to bleed. That pressure does not stay at the contact line, because the same war is described as using explosive kamikaze drones against targets that should be protected, including medical facilities, which drags rear systems into the same stress cycle. Even when these strikes are more common in daylight due to visibility, the threat still shapes night routines. Since hospitals plan for rapid evacuation, staff stay alert for long shifts, and the flow of wounded keeps the rooms full. The message is simple and brutal. Safety is conditional, and the war can reach behind the fight with tools that do not need a frontline breakthrough to cause harm. When the rear is tense and the front is sleepless, fatigue becomes a hidden weapon, because shorter rest leads to slower judgment, and slower judgment turns small mistakes into chain losses. And that is why the story cannot end on the idea of control, because even the best training cannot cancel the random fragment or the sudden strike that can erase a life in one unlucky second. The moment the sniper is badly wounded, the story stops feeling like a controlled mission and starts looking like what this war really is, a place where skill helps, but chance still gets a vote. In the account, the enemy closes to roughly 150 meters, which is close enough that one wrong step, one exposed angle, or one fast push can change everything. Soon after, a grenade fragment hits and damages the spine area, and that kind of wound is feared because it can turn fatal fast if bleeding or shock takes over. He is moved to a nearby hospital, the projectile is removed, and he is described as lucky because it does not leave permanent damage. But the detail that sticks is what he keeps. He saves the fragment as a reminder, and it signals a hard truth that 1 second can rewrite a whole life even for a trained shooter. That is the thin line in this conflict, since indirect fire and drones can reach anyone, and they do not care about rank, skill, or reputation. As the war drags on, that risk grows, because more days in the field means more exposure to the random strike that no plan can fully block. This injury also opens the wider story of foreign volunteers. Many arrive with strong motives like values, duty, or a belief that Ukraine's fight matters beyond its borders. Yet high-intensity war is not only about shooting, because it is also about hours of waiting under threat, then sudden violence from systems you may never see. That gap between expectation and reality helps explain why some reports describe around 20% quitting after an early experience with Russian artillery. Artillery does not reward bravery. It rewards distance and cover, and newcomers often learn that lesson in one brutal day. So the early wave of signups shrinks into a smaller core that can stay through the stress. That is why contracts get tighter. Later terms are described as requiring a minimum 6-month commitment, with no guarantee about where a volunteer will be sent, which is meant to reduce churn and keep units stable. Money also plays a role, even when people prefer to talk only about principles. The pay is described as ranging from about $50 per month for non-combat roles away from the line up to about $2,800 for direct combat service. And that spread helps explain why new recruits still appear. But pay cannot buy safety. The sources also mention volunteer deaths, with an estimate of more than 100 killed in the first year, and that number is enough to show the cost is real. So the picture stays mixed. These volunteers carry symbolic weight, but they also take real hits. And that is where the story turns back to the larger question of how long this war can keep burning without an exit. This story ends with a hard truth. Because foreign snipers and international fighters bring both tactical value and symbolic weight. And that combination signals that Ukraine is not standing alone. A trained shooter can slow movement, break confidence, and force enemies to treat the night as a risk zone, yet the same war can still reach him with one random fragment. That is the balance on this front, where skill and courage matter, but chance, artillery, and drones keep rewriting outcomes without warning. When darkness is no longer cover, every side pays a higher mental price, because rest becomes shorter, routes become slower, and small mistakes spread into larger losses. So the question is not only who wins a firefight, but who can hold discipline and support long enough for politics to catch up. A strong deal could freeze the bleeding, but without it, this conflict will keep pulling people in and wearing them down night after night. Stay with Military Force, hit like, and subscribe for clear, grounded battlefield analysis you can trust.